and of Venezuelan Worker Solidarity. I'll be moderating and facilitating the discussion today. We have a packed agenda for today. We have four amazing speakers, Robert Coffey, Joe Allen, Isabel Barter, and Megan Day. I think, sorry, your last name escaped me. The plan for today is first a round of presentations from each of our four speakers for about 7 to 8 minutes each. And we're going to move on to about 45 minutes of discussion, for which we will have a stack. So when we get there, please feel free to add your name on the stack to intervene in discussion. We'll have about 2.5 minutes per person in discussion, so we get to hear from as many comments as we can. And we'll close in with one last round of comments from each of the speakers towards the end, and finally 5 minutes of announcements. So today's webinar on how to fight the far right, we count with 4 people, each of whom has been organizing in different fields in different cities with different assessments of what the current crisis of US politics consists on, how to organize to defeat the far right and those that enable it at different levels of the state. Our first speaker today is going to be Joe Allen, who has been a socialist for about 4 decades and a prolific author and activist. In the 90s, he was a member of the Midwest Network to Stop the Klan. And over the past decade, he has written and researched on the far right in US history and in contemporary politics, and he's a member of the DSA in Chicago. Our second speaker, I don't know if Megan or Robert would want to go first, but Megan Lessard is a member of New York City for Abortion Rights, which does extraordinary work in building an active presence in defending the right to abortion, in forming pickets, in confronting far-right activists who try to intimidate people outside of the clinics. Robert Coffey is a revolutionary socialist who's a co-founder of the Socialist Workers Alliance of Guyana. He lives in Brooklyn, works in child welfare, and is a member of DC 37 as a rank and file member of its Progressive Caucus, and is part of both the Afro-Socialist Caucus and the labor branch of the New York City DSA. And our last speaker, Isabel, is an anti-fascist activist, originally from Rochester, New York, who's been a street medic on the front lines of the recent Black Lives Matter protests in her new hometown of Portland, Oregon for the last 3.5 months, including some amazing work in building an entire street medics collective that I hope she might touch upon either in her presentation or her discussion. So for stack, how it's gonna work, we're gonna keep a progressive stack, which means that I'm not necessarily gonna call on people according to the order in which they sign up to speak, which on Zoom can be a bit chaotic in the to begin with, but rather to try to keep as much as possible a diversity of speakers. And I'm also going to prioritize questions and direct responses from the speakers to those questions, which I hope are a bit briefer than full-on comments. We're going to keep time, so at about 2 minutes, you can pay attention to either myself or to Haley, who's going to be helping me with time, because we'll ask you to wrap up, and we would feel very uncomfortable cutting off anyone's mic, but we really want to have as many people speaking as possible, because that's an opportunity that we haven't had in a very long while to come together about 100 different activists from around the country and think about strategy of how to organize and how to unite in the face of like the grave threats that are ahead of us. For Stack, please write your name on the chat and I will write it down. Write your name and or your first name for Stack, and I will be calling on you and giving a heads up to the person following. I think, and the last thing for people who have joined the since, keep in mind that Zoom is a relatively public space, that even though we do have people in charge of security and we've had a registration process before sending out the link to the meeting, that if you are concerned about security or you want to change your name just to your first name or to a pseudonym, that's also fine. If you wanted to turn off your camera, that's also fine. And obviously for discussion, both in the chat and in the discussion section, please remember that that we want to have a comradely discussion. We do have a very strong polarizing issues, both in the politics and in the US left, and we want to make sure that this is a space where we can discuss those with comradely terms and honest and clear political discussion that doesn't get muddled by anything that distracts from those issues. So without further ado, I think we can start. I'm going to call first on Joe and then on Megan, if that's okay. So you have 8 minutes. At about 5 minutes, I'll send you a text just to let you know that you're on time, that you have three more minutes. So just to start wrapping up.
Thanks a lot, Alejandro. I just wanted to start. Can everybody hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up or great, fantastic. Because AT&T is my service provider, whenever it's windy, I have bad internet connection. So give me a wave if you can't hear me. I wanted to start off just by saying we've just seen an amazing victory over fascism in Greece, and to extend our congratulations and solidarity to our Greek comrades who carried out really quite an amazing campaign, both in the courtroom and outside the courtroom, to get the proudly Nazi Golden Dawn labeled a criminal organization. While this may not put an end to fascism in Greece, it is certainly a major blow to fascism in Europe. I'm sure there's things that we can learn from this campaign that we can bring here to the United States, and I hope we can talk to our Greek comrades about that campaign and those issues and its relevance. But it's a pretty amazing political development. I had an article posted a few weeks ago on Tempest. Some people probably saw it. It was called "A Threshold Has Been Crossed." It was our attempt to kind of come to grips with the resurgence of an armed far-right movement in this country, which has the sympathy of the state, local police officers, and the President of the United States. It very much began in the springtime around sort of these demonstrations to, quote, reopen the economy in a lot of places, but specifically in the upper Midwest. It was egged on by Trump, and to some degree over the last week, it was revealed that a small paramilitary group, the Wolverine Watchmen, were attempting to carry out the kidnapping of the Michigan governor in an attempt to start a race war. Whatever practical politics that may have not really reflect on their part, it goes to show that there's a new and very dangerous right in this country. And that it very much sees itself as being a force directed at Black Lives Matter, that is, at the new Black liberation movement in this country, and against the new socialist left. We need to take this threat very, very, very seriously. A lot of what I'm going to say today is really about what comes after Trump, because one of the positive developments, I think there's many positive developments for building an anti-fascist movement in this country. And the first is simply, we've just been through a national uprising against racism, where 15 to 26 million people, the New York Times estimated, came out in very multiracial demonstrations in this country, all over the place, every state, every major city, suburb, small towns, against racism. And we far outdwarf the forces of the organized far right, whether they call themselves patriot groups or vigilantes or whatever. We are far, far bigger than what they are on the ground. It's also hopeful, I think, that Donald Trump seems to be carrying out a very determined path to be a one-term president, unless something is going on that I think is not visible to us right now. Donald Trump will probably lose the presidency by a clear majority, if not more so, in the next few weeks. And this will produce, I think, along with the arrest of the Michigan militia, something of a temporary crisis for the far right, which will give us some space to think and to organize. And what comes next, I think, will be playing a part in building that new anti-fascist movement. just a few overall points and then a couple of things about the future. I think we should say, I think we all recognize that 2016 was a turning point for both the left and the right in this country. That is that Bernie's presidential campaign and then Trump's campaign of the election was selection to the presidency, maybe that's a better way of putting it, legitimized both socialism and authoritarian politics in this country. And I don't think that either one is going away. We also know that the attempt by the far right to take advantage of this in the early days of the Trump administration led to disaster for them. So in August 2017, in Charlottesville, as we all know, they attempted to hold the biggest far right rally demonstration since the late 1930s. And it both was frightening, but we mobilized thousands of people against them. But it ended in disaster for them when James Field murdered Heather Heyer and injured many other people when he drove his car into an anti-fascist demonstration. Soon afterwards, we saw mass demonstrations in Boston. I think it was 40,000 people who came out against them, and equally large numbers in the Bay Area against the far right, which produced a major crisis for the far right. Many groups disintegrated, fell apart, went to war with each other. Some people just disappeared from public view. If you were sick and tired of Richard Spencer, he went into semi-retirement only to reemerge to endorse Joe Biden, one of the great ironies of our time. That was only a few short years ago. However, this year, as I was said before, we've seen a resurgence of the far right. And this has very much been egged on by Trump, who they've relied quite heavily on for legitimacy, political credibility, and so forth. One of the things I think about the next few weeks, obviously, is great concerns about whether we will see the type of voter intimidation that Trump has been sort of, bellowing about in Washington, and whether militias will respond to his efforts to do that or not. People I know across the country are involved in many different aspects of defending voting rights, protecting their neighborhoods, defending immigrants, defending abortion rights, and all these local campaigns. I think we want to see these as kind of the local efforts at hopefully creating a new national anti-fascist movement in the future. But I think there's also some very serious political problems that we also need to confront. One outgrowth, for example, and I've seen this and read this in a few places, of the FBI's arrest of the Michigan militia has been, of course, the fact that many liberals are now talking about how under the next Biden administration, because the FBI will once again assume its credible role as a law enforcement agency, that they will unleash the FBI on the far right in this country. And I think as both socialists and anti-racist activists who have a political memory, is we know that the FBI is far more interested in fighting a Black liberation movement and the socialist movement than the far right. So that will make will be assumed be a big political difference between us and our liberal friends. The other is how do we begin to build a movement, particularly in working class neighborhoods and institutions, against the far right. One of the things that people may know from my writings on this issue over the last decade is my great concern about the influence and support for various far right ideas that exist among a broad layer of American workers, whether that be xenophobic ideas against immigrants, around the issue of China, old-fashioned American anti-Black racism. That's not meant to diminish that, but that's a constant problem and historic problem in the American working class. But also added to it has been the widespread, acceptance of these, QAnon theories, which to me are just kind of rehabilitated anti-Semitism. And these are widespread. I mean, these are not isolated ideas. So I think when and we also have to, I think after the events recently in Michigan, is to keep in mind that the far right, though it may be extremely primitive in its politics and even comical in some of the things that they do sometimes, is that they are extremely dangerous. I mean, what we learned, back in 1995 is that two guys in a truck can do a hell of a lot of damage to people. How one specifically deals with that is a difficult political question. But I think trying to root the next anti-fascist movement in working class communities and in working class institutions is going to be, I think, one of the most important things that we would do. And I think that that can start, or hopefully I think we can start that inside of the teacher unions, which are such a flashpoint for both the vitriol of the right, both mainstream and far, but also have been one of the most important in terms of fighting back and showing leadership in the working class over the last few years. I think ultimately, though, I think one of the things that we have to really think about is the importance of being very clear about what our political objectives are. Many of us are members of DSA, many socialists are not, but I think we all agree that the ultimate answer to defeating the fascists is building a working class socialist alternative. So anti-fascism shouldn't be seen as some kind of sectional interest or a one-off affair, but 2016 showed us that it's now a permanent feature of American politics, and that we need to build an ongoing anti-fascist movement to defeat it. So I'll end there, and hopefully we can kick off a broader discussion.
Thank you so much, Joe. I'm going to pass it on now to Megan.
Hi. My name is Megan Lessard, and I'm an organizer with New York City for Abortion Rights, or NYC-FAR for short. We formed in the wake of President Trump's inauguration in 2017, when anti-abortion activists planned to hold mass protests outside Planned Parenthoods across the country as part of a day of action to demand the organization's defunding and the criminalization of abortion. Professionalized reproductive rights groups like NARAL, Planned Parenthood, responded in the same sort of anemic fashion as they've been responding to right-wing incursions for years, calling for donations to Planned Parenthood, circulating online petitions, and encouraging us all to vote blue in downstream elections. And crucially, they discourage any kind of direct engagement with the antis. In New York, Planned Parenthood's executive leadership scheduled a rally in Washington Square Park for the same time as literally hundreds of anti-abortion protesters were planning to descend on the Bleecker Street Planned Parenthood clinic, just a few blocks away. So without any organized strategy for confronting this right-wing mobilization outside our clinics and in our streets, a loose coalition of socialists, feminists, and advocates for reproductive justice came together to stage a counter protest outside that Bleecker Street Planned Parenthood. We met these right-wing forces where they appeared. We turned out hundreds of supporters that day. We blocked patients from having to see these anti-abortion protesters. We held a really powerful speak out during which people shared moving testimonies about their own abortions, the role that reproductive freedom had played in their own lives. And we really took the antis by surprise that day. They did not expect us to be out there. And part of that is because the mainstream reproductive rights movement has ceded so much ground, literally ground, in outside of their clinics. They really discourage any kind of more militant clinic defense or tactics to confront the right directly outside of their doors. They've tried unsuccessfully for years to sort of depoliticize the space outside of abortion clinics. And we, as an organization, believe that that is a losing strategy. So we approach our work with the understanding that, in the words of feminist critic Laura Briggs, all politics are reproductive politics. So in the most fundamental sense, the AFAB, or assigned female at birth body, with its capacity to gestate and to give birth to new life, it's a crucial site of production. Until everything's fully automated, we're going to need new workers, a constant supply of new workers. and oppressive hierarchical systems, from capitalism to patriarchy to more authoritarian tendencies. They depend quite literally on the unremunerated labor of people born female, not just pregnancy and childbirth, but social reproduction, the invisible caregiving work that keeps the whole system in motion. So abortion really does pose an existential threat to maintaining a rigid racialized social order. And the right will do anything to prevent people from disrupting that order. It's no coincidence that a right-wing movement decrying illegal immigration is also staunchly anti-abortion. You can hear this so-called birth panic rhetoric across the right, from Donald Trump's recent rally in Minnesota, where he drummed up resentment against refugees, from hand-wringing about declining birth rates and the potential impact on the economy, and we have overt racist pronatalism from politicians like Iowa Rep. Steve King, who he sort of says what Donald Trump is maybe not afraid, but hasn't said yet. In 2017, he's quoted as saying, "You cannot rebuild your civilization with somebody else's babies. You've got to keep your birth rate up. And with that, you need to teach your children your values. In doing so, you can grow your population, you can strengthen your culture, and you can strengthen your way of life." Yeah, so yes, Steve King being sort of like the id of the far right, like, really kind of articulates what everybody is thinking, that white Christian women need to have more babies. New York City for abortion rights, believing strongly that all politics tied in some way to reproductive politics, we place a heavy emphasis on direct action because we see abortion clinics as an important site for that right-wing movement building. Anti-abortion politics, it's at the center of right-wing ideology, but also authoritarianism has certain spatial demands. To grow, it needs access to public space. It needs visibility. It needs to bind people together affectively through spectacle and through violence. And in the United States, for different historical reasons, a large percentage of abortions are performed at freestanding clinics. And so they're a prime target for the right. And we as a group maintain that any kind of oppositional presence outside of a clinic is a form of intimidation, and that their goal of enforcing birth is inherently violent. But it's important to recognize that this violence isn't always overt. Not everybody holding a fetus poster outside of Planned Parenthood is a 3%er. There are churches, there are grandmothers, there are people sort of praying. We hear that a lot in New York. We get regular groups of churchgoers protesting outside of that same Bleecker Street Planned Parenthood that Trump's post-inauguration demonstration was held at, and they respond to our critique by saying, "Oh, we're just praying. We're just praying. It's just a peaceful expression. It's our First Amendment right." So we see abortion as kind of an issue at which all these different right-wing tendencies converge. From your prayerful grandmother to your Proud Boy. Fascism really needs to secure the buy-in of an aggrieved middle class, upset with stagnant wages, falling standards of living, loss of status, misdirected anger at outsider groups, etc. And the grandmas outside of abortion clinics kind of make the Proud Boys acceptable. So we've seen that the liberal repro rights response to this rising wave of aggression has been utterly passive, and we think that it again is a failing strategy to just to depoliticize the space outside of abortion clinics It's sort of a fantasy that if we ignore their harassment, we can sort of defend abortion in apolitical terms with slogans like abortion is healthcare and abortion is just one of the many services that Planned Parenthood provides. And we believe fundamentally that this is not an anti-fascist strategy and it's not a winning strategy. And as abortion activists, we don't want to fight within the neoliberal confines of personal choice and autonomy, but against a system to which economic exploitation, racist violence, and the subjugation of AFAB people are absolutely essential. So to that, we're calling for the mobilization of street-based activism. We need a fighting grassroots movement for reproductive justice and to confront the right wherever it appears.
Thank you so much, comrade. Sorry, I'm gonna pass it on to Robert.
Thank you, Ale. Sorry, I'm still in the... This is me about to say I'm still in the phase of my life where I do too many things at the same time. So I'm like technically at a protest. So I'm in a car doing this presentation. But I wanted to thank the comrades from Tempest for inviting me, and thank Joe and Megan for their presentations, for really grounding us in the historical moment that we're in. Funnily enough, in preparing for this, I found the notes from like a similar talk on fascism and anti-fascism I did a few years ago, and it's been very instructive to look at what I wrote then and how things have changed in the 3 years or so. And I think one of the things that's more palpable is that like there's the threat of the far right is much more acute, and I think everyone is feeling that. And the specific fact that we're living not just in an election year, but in an election year where COVID-19 has killed over 200,000 people in the United States alone, many more across the world, and we're facing an economic crisis as well, and this crisis of racism to which the Black Lives Matter movement has responded just puts everything into sharper definition. And though the panel is structured around fighting the far right, I think inevitably you must speak on the question of fascism. And it's not coincidental, I think, that, Joe started with pointing out the victory against Golden Dawn in Greece, an openly fascist organization, because that is the extreme to which the far right goes, right? That there's levels of reaction, fascism being the worst. And to be the semi-orthodox Marxist that I am, I do think it's important to speak and to have a conception of fascism to go forward. And I like Leon Trotsky's definition because it is both orthodox and a dynamic definition. Clearly, there's different aspects of it that have changed in the almost a century since it was written. History, of course, can't be carried along by old quotes, but it's good to build on. So Trotsky says, quote, that at the moment, normal police and military resources of the bourgeois dictatorship, together with their parliamentary screens, no longer suffice to hold society in a state of equilibrium. The turn of the fascist regime arrives. Through the fascist agency, capitalism sets in motion the masses of the crazed petty bourgeoisie and the bands of declassed and demoralized lumpen proletariat, all the countless human beings whom finance capital itself has brought to desperation and frenzy. Trotsky goes on to say that, fascism demands that the bourgeoisie carry out its most extreme task of liquidating workers' organizations and any kind of organizations of struggle. And I think we can say that today that's not the social structure of the state in the United States. But it's important to note that, between a bourgeois democracy and fascism, there are many different forms that the state can take. And it's important to then concretely analyze the historical moment that we're in. And to do that, you have to look to see how we got here. And I think you then have to examine the issue of Trump and Trumpism. Where did this guy come from? Right? And I think Trump is located within the increase and the rise of right-wing populism across the world, and populism generally, but specifically right-wing populism. And it came about as a result and a reaction to the economic crisis from the subprime mortgage crisis, which, like many things in the world in the United States, started with the theft of Black wealth through the subprime mortgage crisis. And then as those mortgage securities were bundled and sold across the world, when Black people couldn't repay the loans and there was this massive effect in the US housing market, it rippled across the world. And we've still not fully recovered from that Great Recession. But one of the responses to it is that people, working class people, rose up and said, this is enough, right? So we saw movements like Occupy Wall Street and even the Tea Party come to the fore, movements that said, we want to fight back against the establishment. This insider politics thing is not working for us regular folk. We need to change the state in such a way and change society in such a way that the common person gets their share. And historically, these populist movements never achieved that task of the democratization of the state. And in failing to achieve that task, one of the things that kind of happens is that they then invest their energies into populist figures, right? So this might be controversial for the left perspective, but on the left perspective, those energies were invested into Bernie Sanders and his campaign. On the right, it was invested into Trump. And not to replay the whole 2016 election, but we know that Trump was able to outmaneuver the various wings of the Republican Party by speaking to both the real suffering that the Republicans' base was going through and the racist mythology of the American golden age of capitalism, where, you know, white supremacy was more openly tolerated, make America great again. And in many ways, the Democrats were not able to compete with Trump on a populist note because their response to make America great again was, of course, that America is already great, which is a lack of acknowledgement for the suffering people were going through. So some other traits of populism is that it kind of looks to this populist figure the way in which people in the Bible might have looked to Jesus as he threw the money changers out of the temple, right? That this person's coming in to clean house. In the same way Bernie said he needed to come in and break up the banks, Trump said he was going to come in, he was going to drain the swamp. And this is the hope. But this is connected to fascism because to pull these things off, you need close and tight control of the state. And I think to talk about the far right in the United States, and for us to only focus on the far right vigilante groups and the far right petty bourgeois groups and not talk about the role of the state is pretty mistaken, because Joe alluded to the way in which Trump dog whistled the right into the Charlottesville demonstration, right? By giving them subtle clues that it was okay to come out and be what you are. But it's gone beyond subtle clues. Now, obviously, if at a national televised debate, the president can tell the Proud Boys to stand by. And almost nothing happens in the US specifically without the sanction and the blessing of the state, just because there's such an enormous state apparatus that if you don't really kowtow to it, it can come in and repress you. And the fact that the state is given a green light to fascist groups is an indicator that we're moving away from right-wing populism into a kind of semi-Bonapartist figure in Trump, who is willing to mobilize these crazed petty bourgeois masses in the way Trotsky talks about. And he's also willing to transform the state in its configuration as an armed body of men into a direct tool of repression against social movements. So we've seen, for example, in response to Black Lives Matter, Trump wanted to just bring the military straight out to crush the protests. The rest of the bourgeoisie and the national security establishment disagreed with him, but then he found a workaround. And he created BORTAC, this federal police force that was dispatched to places where the Black Lives Matter movement was at its height. And I think that there's clearly a movement in this direction, because even the unprecedented things that Trump has brought about, like an attorney general that doesn't, I'm gonna wrap up, thank you. An attorney general that doesn't make a pretense to objectivity and makes clear that I'm Trump's man, and is the person who helped Trump to put together the federal police. Even now, Trump is saying that William Barr, the attorney general, is not going far enough. Why aren't you prosecuting my political enemies? And I think what that points to, that we're in a moment where, yes, we have bourgeois democracy in this country. Of course, it has its huge and gaping holes, but we want to preserve what we have, because the democracy we have is something we fought hard for. It wasn't gifted to us by anyone. And if people are using fascism as a bogey, we then say, well, between democracy and fascism, there are many things. And it seems like we're on the verge of a constitutional coup, right? I'm glad Alejandro is here. He can speak to how constitutional coups happen in Venezuela, where you restrict the rights to certain bodies that are supposed to be checks and balances on the executive. So I'll end it there to say that to speak on the question of the far right, we have to both speak to not just how our movements fight it, but we have to understand it, and we have to analyze it and deal with this question of living history that Walter Rodney talks about. Because it's very easy for me to dust off a Trotsky quote and bring it to you. It's much harder for me to say in October 2020 in the United States, this is our analysis. And if we don't share a common ground, we're going to have our struggles very much disoriented. So I think, the practical steps being taken by people like Megan with New York City for abortion rights clearly need to go forward with movements in the streets, but we cannot ignore the organs of the state that can be used as well. In the victory in Greece, for example, we heard people were fighting in the streets and they fought in the courts to get a victory against Golden Dawn, and we should not be counterposing those two things to each other.
Thank you so much, Comrade. And our last speaker, Isabel.
Hey, thanks everybody so much. So thanks, Ali, for the introduction, and Tempest for hosting, and the other speakers. Just like as a quick note, I didn't build a street medic collective in Portland, but I did rebuild an ambulance, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah, well, Robert basically broke down everything that we need to know about fascism historically. Like, I think double points for a Trotsky quote. But in seriousness, I think that you're totally right, Robert, that it's all well and good to be able to share this historical view, but what we need to do is a little bit more. It's pressing both to talk about like the situation we're in right now, and also what we need to do. And so I do want to talk a little bit about a bit of an analysis from Rochester, because I think it is important to know that the place that I'm seeing fascists come from in Portland, and obviously Portland has a huge problem with fascist groups who are organized and armed and have a consensus around the way that they want to attack the left, and also a political platform that they want to push forward. I think it's important that we recognize some of the economic tendencies that have existed in the country since the 70s and the economic collapse, the economic crisis that happened then. And that's the heart of neoliberalism. And I think the heart of like for instance, in my city, in Rochester, the closing of Kodak, which was the main employer in Rochester, and how that has led to not only the layoffs of thousands of shop floor workers, but also the engineers and chemists and shop floor managers that were supported, were also employed by that company. And I think to a large extent, the city has never recovered, ever. It hasn't even come close. And the suburbs has probably not really recovered as much either, Although you can see that in the suburbs in Rochester, there's a suburb that touches the city of Rochester that has the best school district in New York. And then there's there's Rochester, which is the worst school district in New York. So I think that we have to think about what are the economic forces at play. And what I see, what's very obvious to me is that there's a dissatisfied middle class, and especially an upper middle class, that are not doing as well as their parents, or feeling like they're not having as easy of a time. There's not as much upward mobility inside of the middle class. So lower middle class folks trying to eke out a better living are not able to. And the groups that have the best ready-made politics to answer why that exists are the near right, if you will, near right politicians who thrive on racism, xenophobia, and have really shifted farther and farther right on those questions. And then of course, fascists, the fascist cadre, who have said all along that the issue is, multiculturalism, globalization, and all of those things. And so I think that these ideas are finding a foothold in areas where you have bands, like tighter communities of, white men who are dissatisfied with the way that the world is going, and also have the means to buy arms and armor and the job security, to be able to go out into the streets on the weekends with, sometimes without even a mask on, with just bold-faced, and think that they can get away with it. And so what that has meant in Portland is that you have days like August 25th or August 24th, where probably the largest gathering of fascist protesters came. The Proud Boys and a bunch of other people came, and they used bear mace and improvised pepper bombs, smoke grenades, and things like that, and were just openly throwing those things into the larger, but not much larger, crowd of anti-fascists. And what strikes me most about that particular day is, one, the volume of patients that I treated. I mean, I treated dozens and dozens and dozens of patients with, who are covered head to toe in chemical weapons of some sort or another, probably hot sauce or whatever, but could be any chemicals. And of course, the fact that as soon as the fascist protesters left, the federal agents and the police in Portland declared a riot immediately. So as soon as the last person from the fascist protest was in the parking garage where they were all parked, immediately there was a riot declared, because the anti-fascists were still in the streets. So I think it's really important to know that the state is not going to do anything to prevent right-wing violence, even in a city like Portland, where it's supposedly so liberal and the police force is under mayoral control and the mayor is supposedly so liberal. The mayor could have easily said, broken things up immediately, sent everybody home, declared a riot while there were still fascists there, but decided not to. So I think that that's really important, that that's what your liberal city will probably have to expect when that happens. I also want to say that from the perspective of the Black Lives Matter protests, the state has completely failed us. And I think that that's also important to recognize. Ambulances won't come into protest zones. Riots are declared. We've been blanketed with tear gas because of the BORTAC teams and also the police. And so I think, what we need to look to now is, yes, there's the economic considerations. There's all the things that the other speakers were talking about, but we also need to think about what can we do to protect our own communities. And I think that the most important thing we've done in Portland is that we have mutual aid groups. We have hundreds of medics. We have thousands of people, who are doing some kind of support for the protests. Those people have also moved into anti-fascist work when that's been necessary, evacuation work for the fires, and everything like that. And so I think that right now is the time to build communities. It's the time to figure out what is it that you're going to provide if, you know, if things get worse, and to figure out, you know, what mass mobilization needs to happen. So now is the time to organize, because if we had met the fascists on the 24th with 10,000 people, I don't think they'd be so bold to be covering people with you know, improvised weapons and things like that. When we meet them 2-to-1, when we meet them 1-on-1, or God forbid, when they catch us alone, things are quite different. And I think that Joe spoke about it, and this is what I want to end with. What we're seeing in Portland is what happens when there's a runaway fascist movement. When the fascist movement is growing and the anti-fascist movement is not growing, or the anti-fascist movement is staying still. So if you're in a city that doesn't have, that isn't the headquarters of the Proud Boys, be happy about that, but get ready. And if you are in a city like Portland, or, you know, anywhere else in the Pacific Northwest where the Proud Boys have a huge presence, or any of the militias in the Midwest, I would say now is the time to get organized, get ready, understand how you can mobilize 10,000 people tomorrow, because you might have to. So I think that's mostly what I'll say. And also get ready to replace the state, because, you know, as we saw in Portland, the idea that an ambulance is on the way is a luxury. The idea that a hospital won't be completely crowded with people is a luxury. COVID's taught us that as well. The idea that PPE will be provided to your hospital is a luxury. And so we need to, I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, but we have a lot of organizing work to do on the ground, and it does not come from voting for Joe Biden. It comes from talking to your neighbors and building organizations, whatever those organizations may be.
Thank you, Isabel. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all four of our speakers, Robert, Joe, Megan, and Isabel, for their presentations. I think each one was extremely rich in different aspects, from experience, from reading and research. And I wanted to open up the floor for discussion. We're going to have about 45 minutes